So now we are recording. And let me just start the recording over here.
Good afternoon.
1 second. 1 sec. And just going live. 1 sec. Okay, and we are live in 3, 2, 1.
I want to thank the sponsors for today's class, Jeff and Lori Goldshin. It's becoming a tradition. It's nice. It's a nice tradition. It's a good tradition. This is in honor of the birth of a baby boy to Shani and Idan Kfir and their grandparents, Cheryl and Yuval Schusterman, who come to this class regularly. A big mazel tov to them, to their proud grandparents, and a mazel tov to the Kfirs. We should all have many, many simchas. The next of my evening lectures, it's the last of the lecture series, is going to be Thursday, March 2nd. There was a change of a date there. The subject will be Calling All Heroes. It'll be at 7:30 p.m., and you're all welcome to join us, hopefully live and in person, but if not, in any other way that you tune in through Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube, we love to have you join with us. This coming week here in the Conejo Valley is Kosher Awareness Week. We're going to be having kosher booths over at Smart and Final, at Ralph's, and in Vaughn's sometime during the week. It won't be during the Super Bowl itself because we know that you'll be preoccupied. But for during the week, there will be kosher booths and information available. Also, as you may have seen some of the announcements, a new kosher restaurant is open in Westlake Village. It's called Hummus Lali. It's a wonderful Middle Eastern style restaurant, yet they do have burgers because people in the Middle East eat burgers as well. But they have great schnitzel and shawarma and falafels. It's fantastic, so do enjoy. Also remember we have Pizza Nosh right here in Agora, and we have Conejo Kosher a few feet away from here. So do help support our kosher stores and eateries. It's beautiful to have. You know, there's more kosher food available right here in the small little Conejo Valley than there is in the entire San Diego region. So you're fortunate, you're lucky you have it. We're going to open up a gym soon because we're all going to need it. So last week, we came to a verse, you don't need the text in front of you right now, we came to a verse where Moses is telling the people that when you come into the land of Israel, God is going to designate a specific place where he's going to have his holy temple. A place of worship will be in a very specific place. And he doesn't identify in the book of Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, the name of the place. But in the portion of Re'eh itself, 20 times he will say, remember, there's going to be a place that God has in mind, a very specific place. You'll get hints. It's a mountain. It's a temple mountain. So we all know the place that we're talking about. We're talking about Jerusalem, and we're talking about the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. We know the place we're talking about, and we're familiar with this place already from the book of Genesis, because things have already happened at this place. The famous story of the binding of Isaac. If you remember, God comes to Abraham and he says, go to the mountain that I will show you. It was called Har HaMoriah, the mountain where God will appear. The mountain where there is this spiritual connection. Again, we know that mountain. It's the same mountain that Jacob will go to sleep on his way into exile, where he's running from his brother, and he will have this famous dream of a ladder going up with angels going up and going down. That takes place on this mountain. I mentioned last week that by name, Jerusalem is mentioned in the books of the prophets and the books of the writings close to 1,000 times. Yerushalayim, it's everywhere. We have it in, King Solomon writes when he dedicated the first temple. He talks and he says, since the day I brought my people forth from the land of Egypt, I chose no city out of all the tribes of Israel, except I choose Jerusalem, va'efcha b'Yerushalayim, liyoy shemi sham, that my name will be there. And as they mentioned over and over and over, Yerushalayim. And so the question I asked last week is, if Jerusalem is so central to Jewish life and to the Jewish people and to Jewish history and to Jewish destiny, which it is, why in the 5 books of Moses itself do we not find that one word, Yerushalayim? We find a lot of references to Jerusalem. We find references to the mountain. We know events that took place at the mountain. But the very word itself, Yerushalayim, is not found in the 5 books of Moses, but it's found right after the 5 books of Moses comes to an end and the book of Joshua opens, it's mentioned. Once the Jewish people enter into the land, it's mentioned over and over and over and over again. So last week I gave you some of the answers that Maimonides puts forth. Some of them were, if it was identified before, the nations of the world would have saw to it that the Jewish people never get near Jerusalem. If it was already known by then that Jerusalem is going to be where the temple of the Jewish people will be, they never would have allowed us. There would have been warfare, continuous warfare, and King David would never have had a chance to establish it as its capital because it would have been the focus of the entire world as we see it is today. And therefore, so long as we can keep its identity a little bit hidden, we kept it hidden until it was time to make it the capital, and King David does so. There was another avenue of understanding, and that is that God did not want to cause jealousy amongst the tribes of Israel as to which tribe will be the ones that will have the Temple Mount within their geography, and therefore he first wanted to focus the years of settling everyone in. Once you got used to your neighborhood, your fields, your farms, and you developed your farms, you fell in love with your land, now you can handle it perhaps that the Holy Temple was not in your geography but in the different tribes. But if Moses would have identified it back then, you could just imagine what would be taking place between that period of time and the entering. The lobbying that would go on to Joshua, you make sure we get it, you make sure we get it, you make sure. And therefore, says Maimonides, in order to keep the peace amongst the people, the name was not mentioned just yet, but it's very clearly referenced what mountain God was talking about. All that is good, but I think we need something more, which means those are on the negative side. Negative meaning we're afraid of hostility amongst the tribes. Negative, we're afraid of what it's going to do to the enemies of the Jewish people. I'm looking for something positive, a positive message. That there's a positive message of why by name Yerushalayim is not found in the 5 books of Moses, but found in the books of the prophets and the books of writings and every one of our prayers ever since. There's a strange teaching in the Talmud. The Talmud says, Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught, that one should strive to live in the land of Israel. And even if you're not living in a good neighborhood in Israel, and when they're saying good neighborhood, they're not referring to the scenery, the climate, they're referring to good people, which means it's not the best of people living there. It's better to live in such a city because it's in the land of Israel, rather than living outside the land of Israel. And then the Talmud adds these words, because living outside the land of Israel is regarded as if one has no God. That's strong language. I can understand the privilege of living in the land of Israel. I can even understand the idea, even if it's not the best of neighborhoods, the holiness of living in the land of Israel. I get that. There's so much of writing about the mitzvah, the holiness of living in the land of Israel. There's a question in Jewish law, if someone lives in Israel, are they allowed to ever leave the land of Israel because of the holiness of the land? I understand all that. But to say that those of us not living in the land of Israel as if we're living without a God, that's a strong statement. Most of the sages that we talk about in the era of the Talmud did not live in the land of Israel. They lived in Babylon. There's a Jerusalem Talmud and there's a Babylon Talmud. And the Talmud that most of us study is the Babylonian Talmud, by sages that never lived in Israel. Throughout all of history, some of the most famous of all leaders of the Jewish people did not live in the land of Israel. Understand, it's only modern times that there is this movement to come back to Israel in 1948, where suddenly Israel is back in Jewish hands. But before that, it wasn't easy living in Israel. There always were Jews there, But it was under hostile governance. It wasn't necessarily the most peaceful place in the world. So for thousands of years, for most of our people, we were locked out of Israel by force. It wasn't our choice. So what does the Talmud mean over here? The Creator chose Israel as the Jewish homeland. And he chose Jerusalem as the abode for his manifestation in this physical world. Yet by omitting the name of the city in the Torah itself, in the 5 books of Moses, I believe that God is communicating one of the most important messages of Jewish history and identity. You see, Jerusalem is meta-geographical. What do I mean by that? It's not just that there's one space, physical space called Jerusalem. And it's not just that there's one space where the Holy Temple was. Yes, physically there is. There's only one eternal capital of the Jewish people, that's Jerusalem. There's only one place where the temple was, and that's the Temple Mount. But what Jerusalem represents, what Jerusalem means, what the Holy Temple means, is beyond physical. It's within us. We can create an Israel within us. We can create a Jerusalem within us. We can create a Temple Mount within us. Again, asking a question, it's written in Malachi, it says there that God says, "My name is great among the nations, and everywhere offerings are burnt and offered to my name. My name is great among the nations, says the Lord of the hosts." So there is a teaching that we have here that God says, wherever you want to bring an offering to me, I'm there. But yet it contradicts what we just said in the portion of Deuteronomy. It contradicts the statement that you can only bring it in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. Which way is it? And what's the answer? So long as there was a physical holy temple, that's where we went. But part of the Jewish plan was going to be exile as well. Part of Jewish destiny was going to be exile as well. So has any of you brought an offering this morning? Any of you brought an offering last Passover? Yeah.
I brought myself, and there's another solution, at least for me.
Mm-hmm.
I have the soil of Israel in a pot that's several thousand years old. Dip my fingers in, take some of the soil.
I would sprinkle it on ice cream. There's a way of creating Jerusalem. There's a way of creating Israel in your own lives. So when we went into exile, we needed to find that avenue, that pathway, because we weren't going to be able to get to the Temple Mount. And if we got to the Temple Mount, all we saw was destruction. And we couldn't always get to Israel. So what did the men of the Great Assembly do? Perhaps one of the most critical times of Jewish history. Think about this. So much of Judaism is focused Israel, Jerusalem, Holy Temple. Start going through the 5 books of Moses. Start going through laws. So much of it is when you enter the land, when you enter the land, when you enter the land. And you're going to have farms. You're going to have the corner of the fields when you enter the land. So all of those laws don't apply. I'm not in the land. All the laws about every holiday, about what offering was to be brought in the temple, in the Holy Temple. I don't have those laws. But yet, we all celebrated Passover. We celebrated Shavuot. We celebrated Sukkot. And we've been celebrating it for thousands of years after the Holy Temple was destroyed. The men of the Great Assembly gather after we're thrown out. We're thrown into exile. And at that particular time in history, there was this big question amongst Gentiles of the world and Jews of the world. What was the question? Is there still a chosen people? Is it over? Was there an experiment called the chosen people? And God tried. And he gave you guys, the Jewish people, a set of commandments, a set of ways, and you rebelled. And you didn't follow it. So he canceled the experiment. Proof that he canceled the experiment, you're no longer in Israel. And so much of the Bible is when you enter the land, you enter the land. You're not in the land, so therefore it's canceled. The experiment is over. In fact, there's a whole religion out there calling themselves with a New Testament. What's new about it? Because the Old Testament was given to the Jewish people. But that experiment got canceled, so now there is a New Testament. The men of the Great Assembly realized they need to speak to the Jewish people to say, what's the plan? And taking from the teachings of the Torah, they were able to define for us and show for us that exile is part of the Torah. Exile was mentioned in the Torah. Moses tells us we're going to go into exile, but that the experiment never ends even in exile. Pointing to this verse that I quoted from Malachi, when you're thrown out of the land, then wherever you will call me, I will be. What did we set up in its place? The synagogue, prayers. So when we're praying, what we're doing is we're bringing our offering. As Jack said before, he brings himself. That's our offering. We don't bring sheep and lamb, but we bring the animal within us, the animal soul within us, the animalistic desires within us. We bring that as an offering. Where? I'm not living in Jerusalem right now. I'm living in Agora Hills. So we bring it at the temple in Agora Hills. Where is that? In your own home, in your own Beit HaKnesset, in your house of study. You can create Israel. You can create Jerusalem. You can create a Temple Mount. What do you need? You need the Torah. You need your heart. You need your soul. You need to communicate directly with God. The day will come we'll be reunited in Israel. The day will come that there will be a third holy temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. That day will come. Moshiach is just around the corner, closer than even around the corner. He's right outside the door. He's knocking on the door. We're about ready to open the door. But until that moment, we're still in Israel. We're still in Jerusalem. We still have our Temple Mount. Yes?
Every age believes that there's some one man who is alive, could be a woman, of course, who could be the Messiah, and it's in there, and it's ready, and yet it doesn't happen. Could you explain that?
I can give an entire talk on it, and I will. For now, I'll say it almost seems as if God teases us, that it's dangled before us. There are periods of time where we feel it, and then suddenly it's not there anymore. So our appetite is always whet for it. An example, the 6-Day War. On day 7, after victory was handed to Israel in 6 days, miraculously, Temple Mount back in Jewish hands. Kotel HaMaravi, first time we were able to embrace it, right? Which Jew would not believe on the 7th day that the Messiah was right there?
Moshe Diane.
You have to pick the one person. My point is the excitement of worldwide Jewry, not just observant Jews, not just believing Jews, not just practicing Jews. Every Jew, every secular Jew was running to touch the wall. At that moment, we believed. It was that close. We can feel it. We can feel it. If a donkey came that day with the Messiah riding on it, blowing a shofar, and we saw Elijah, who wouldn't believe? Not just amongst the Jews, amongst the entire world. The world celebrated the miracle of the Jew in Israel. We saw some of that also during the Gulf War, the original Gulf War, the Scud missiles falling in Israel and Israel not being harmed by it. Miracle after miracle that took place. So we've always had those moments. It's almost to get our eyes to open. And let's hope that before you leave class today, we'll be there. There was a poet, his name was Heinrich Heine. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. He was born in Germany. He was a Jewish poet. He lived from 1797 to 1856. He was a romantic poet. But like many other Jews seeking to climb the ladder in German culture and academia, he realized he'll only make it big if he converted out of Judaism. And so he was baptized at the age of 28. And he lived his life. He didn't live a long life. He lived until he was 58. He died while living in Paris. And his last words of his life was, God will forgive me. It's his job. God's job is to forgive us, to understand our mishigasin, the conditions of life that we faced in our lifetime. The interesting thing about his desire to be accepted, his desire for German culture to look up at him as this great poet, was that when thousands of books were burned by the Nazis in Berlin in 1933, they burnt all of Heinrich Heine's books. Why? Because to the Germans, he was a Jew. It made no difference that he converted, that he was, no. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. It's interesting that Heinrich wrote in one of his plays in 1821, he wrote, I'll translate, he wrote it in German, which is close to Yiddish, but I'll read it to you and translate it into English. Where they burn books, they will ultimately also burn people. Where the Nazis burnt the books, they put this plaque up afterwards with Heinrich Heine's quote about if you live in a society that burns books, know that that society will ultimately burn people. How right he was. Anyway, I bring him up because once, during the early 19th century, there was some German scholars he was sitting amongst, and they were having fun talking about the Jewish people, mocking the Jewish people. Now you can see from Heinrich's own writing that he struggled with this. He knew why he converted. It wasn't a theological conversion, so to say. It was, I need to make it up there, and the only way I'll be accepted is if I go through this baptism. So he did, and that's why his last words was, please forgive me, you know why I did what I did. So now he's sitting amongst the elite, and they're mocking the Jews. And it's bothering him. It hurts him. And they say, look at this nomad people. They have no homeland to call their own. And he couldn't hold himself back, and he's saying, you guys are making a mistake about the Jewish people. Because you say they have no homeland. They have a more eternal homeland than the rest of us. They have a portable homeland that they're able to take with them wherever they go. And that's the Torah. How right he was. I mean, to have it coming from someone that lived his life, who got it, who understood it. You think they don't have a homeland? Guess what? Wherever they go, they're taking Israel with them. They're taking Jerusalem with them. They're taking the Temple Mount with them. They open the Torah, they read a word from the Torah, and they're there. Jerusalem is more than geography. It's not just earth. It's the spirit of being. The Temple Mount is a place of the spirit of connection to God. So if we can connect to God where we are, we have created a holy temple right here. That's what it's meant, the place that God will choose. Why does he keep writing that in the 5 books of Moses? The place that God will choose. Of course he's referencing Jerusalem, but he's also referencing all of us who are not living in Israel. The place that God will choose. Your soul, your home. That's the place God will choose. So yes, in the time that Joshua is taking them in, it's all Jerusalem focused. It's all about a physical capital. But there will be a time that we're going to be sent out of Israel. Know that God is still with you. The chosen people is not over. It's not a temporary state of time. It's an eternal state of time. And we as members of that chosen people, we still have our connection to Jerusalem, even if there's those of you in this room that have never been to Jerusalem. Now, I strongly encourage you to visit. I strongly encourage you to study. I strongly encourage you to attach yourself to Jerusalem, to be there for as much as you can, to go to the Western Wall and pray and feel the holiness, absolutely. But know that every single day of your life, every time you open a prayer book, every time you open a Chumash, a Torah, you're connecting to Israel, to Jerusalem, and to a Temple Mount. Benjamin Netanyahu spoke in the year 2012. That was the early days of the birthright movement. You're familiar with birthright, which sends teenagers and young men to Israel. In the early days, they had an audience with Benjamin Netanyahu, and I'll quote what he says. He asked them, have you been to the wall? You touched them, the stones? You're touching your birthright. This is your homeland, literally. This is where we all sprang up from. This is where the Jewish people forged their identity. This is where we lived for thousands of years until we were kicked out for thousands of years. And when we did, something no people has done in history, A lot of people were kicked out and a lot of people disappeared, but we refused to disappear. And we wanted to come back to our homeland, and we did against all odds. How many prayers do we have that word Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jerusalem? We kept it alive because we kept it alive within ourselves. And therefore, it was always there for us. It's because for 2,000 years, even in exile, we never left Jerusalem. We never left. L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, we finished the Passover Seder. It's 12 midnight. We all want to go to sleep. No, stop. First we have to say, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem. We remember Jerusalem at a chuppah, at a marriage ceremony. Wherever we go, Jerusalem. And again, yes, there's a physical Jerusalem, but there's a metaphysical Jerusalem as well. If you choose to direct your life and your thoughts and your mindset and your heart and your behavior towards God, to that space of Jerusalem within our spiritual world, then we're in Jerusalem. The place that God will choose. Because Jerusalem is more than geography. Jerusalem is an energy that's not confined to a specific place. Jerusalem is a vitality that pulsates in our home. So whether we lived in the 10th century, or we lived in the 16th century, or we lived in the 20th century, or we're living in the 21st century, the Jew was walking, whether they walked in Paris, or in Poland, or dealing with communist Russia, or coming to class today in Agora Hills, we're in Jerusalem. The Jew is always in Jerusalem. If you would have asked the Jew on his way to the gas chambers and you would say, where are you going? He would say, I'm going to Jerusalem. It's always been on our mind. Shmuel Joseph Agnon, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, in his 1966 acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize said, as a result of the historic catastrophe in which Titus of Rome destroyed Jerusalem and Israel, we were exiled from its land. But I was born in one of the cities of the exile, yet I always regarded myself as one born in Jerusalem. I remember there was an interview with Nathan Sharansky's wife, Anatoly Sharansky, and they asked her, she was doing a question and answer session with a class that was studying about the Sharanskys. And one of the kids asked her the question, where were you born? And she said, Jerusalem, without blinking an eye. And the kid said, but you guys were in the Soviet prison. We know you were born in Russia. I was asking you which city in Russia you were born with. What do you mean Jerusalem? And she said, a Jew wherever you're born in Jerusalem. That's the way we lived. So when we were first exiled from Jerusalem by the Babylonians, we declared these words. If I forget thee, Yerushalayim, let my right hand lose its strength. Let my tongue cling to my palate if I fail to recall you, if I fail to elevate Jerusalem above my highest joy. And eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yamini. It's not just a beautiful song. It's not just a beautiful line to put up above the ark in the temple. We have lived with that line. We have made that line part and parcel of our existence wherever we have been. That's why when one rises to pray, he prays which direction? Towards Israel. Within Israel, you pray towards Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, you pray towards the Temple Mount. All focused. So if you live in New York and you're praying, you're going to face east. But if you live in Iraq, you're going to face west. If you're on a plane to Israel, what direction do you face?
East.
The cockpit. Why? Because that's heading to Israel. If you're leaving Israel and you want to pray, well, you pray towards the rear of the plane. So we're always focusing on Jerusalem. Why? The land that I will show you. Because it's where God says, this is where I will be. Create a Jerusalem in your mind. Focus on Jerusalem, and you're there. Put yourself there, and you will be there. Where your heart is, where your soul is, that's where you are. So we attach our minds, our hearts, and our souls to Jerusalem, and we're in Jerusalem. There was a story told in the 1930s that Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan, known as the Chafetz Chaim, received a letter from a Jewish soldier who had been drafted into the Polish army. The soldier related in this letter that he was assigned to a remote base. He says, there are no other Jewish soldiers here. There are no religious services here. There's no kosher food here. It's impossible for me to keep Shabbat here. There's no mitzvah I can do. How do I survive as a Jew in this forsaken place? Fair question. What do you want me to do? It's against my will. What am I supposed to do? This was the reply. If it's impossible for you to keep Shabbat, and it's impossible for you to keep kosher, and it's impossible for you to keep all the other mitzvot, don't be discouraged. Because there's one thing you can do. Whenever you have a free moment, even just 10 seconds, stop and speak to God. And face east. If at that moment you just stop and you face east in your mind, you're journeying to Jerusalem. And you're there. And you're embraced by all the spirituality of Israel and Jerusalem. You're there. So take this quick 10-second flight. Face the direction of Israel. Face Jerusalem. And talk to God. Whatever words come out, talk to him. And he will be there. Just as if you were in the holy temple bringing offerings. That same holiness, that same spirituality. Going back to what I began with the Talmud, when the Talmud says it's better to live in Israel than out of Israel, because if you live out of Israel, it's as if you have no God. They're referring to living out of Israel in your own heart, mind, and soul. That you haven't brought Israel into your own existence in your own world. That you're not focusing on that you don't put your heart, mind, soul, and mind into it. But if you do, you're living in Israel, no matter where it is that you may leave. So even when Jerusalem was destroyed and lied in ruins, Yerushalayim, the two combination of the words Yira Shalem, where this meant this is a place that God watches over, a place of peace, that has always been with us. I'm always careful when I touch upon anything political, because this is a safe zone. You can belong to any political movement. So I'm treading very, very carefully. I am only bringing this up, not to talk about any particular political party, but something that I remember being on the news. I want to take you back to the summer of 2012. There was the Democratic National Convention. Most of you don't really pay attention to what's going on at the convention until some excitement takes place. The excitement was more in the earlier years of conventions, when you really didn't know who was going to get the nomination. And then there was fighting on the floor, and there were some conventions that went on for hours until they picked a nominee. There were conventions that you didn't know who the vice president was going to be before the convention. If any of you remember the convention of 1980, when Reagan was nominated, who was going to be his vice president? Does anyone remember? I want to see if there's any political junkies here. Who do they think was going to be his vice president nomination going into the convention? No one. Wow. I'm the only one that wastes time on this, huh?
George isn't here.
Gerald Ford. That's right. Ford, who was president, lost the presidency to Jimmy Carter, was what the rumor mill said that Reagan was going to pick Ford. George Bush went to sleep that night. Went to sleep. Because he was told that Ford was going to get the vice president nomination. It's just in the last second, Ford asked for co-presidency. He wanted to be in charge of foreign policy while Reagan would be in charge of economics, or the other way. He wanted too much. Reagan balked in the last minute and said, wake up George Bush. And that's how George Bush became vice president, which, by the way, put him in position to become president, which, by the way, put his son in position to become president later. Think about it.
Yep.
One little change. And who knows how the world would be different. For good or for bad, it doesn't matter. I'm just talking politics, not in the sense of political science, but just history here.
But that's when the Democrats were democratic.
Again, you're trying to take me to a place I don't want to go. I'm not going. I'm not taking your lead.
But I can go.
You can go any way you want. I
The
can't.
next airport is optional.
Here we
I don't
go.
speak.
So, what takes place the first day and the second day of a convention? Anyone tune in to any convention, Republican, Democrat, whichever year? Do you know what goes on?
Yes.
Well, besides the roll call, what goes on? They're fighting over what's called the platform. Are you familiar with the platform? Wow. That's like I'm a teacher in high school here. Officially, there's a platform, what the party represents. Okay? Every party has a platform. What are you all about? And there is a published platform that actually comes out that nobody in the world reads. Proof? You don't even know about it. And they spend 2 days fighting over the wording of the platform that no one ever really cares about. But that's why conventions take 4 days, because 2 days are being wasted. They're trying to shorten the conventions and get rid of this whole platform thing. But in 2012, there was this discussion, first 2 days of the convention, about the platform. Now, for months leading up to it, there are committees that work on the wording of the platform, and then they put it out there first day for a vote, and then there is amendments to it, and they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Let me see if you remember this from 2012. Some reporter actually read the platform that was voted on and said, I compared it to the same Democratic Party's platform of 2008. A smart reporter to do this. What he was looking for were, what changed? Did we change? Are we doing anything differently in 4 years? If there's an omission, are you sending a statement about something? 2 words that he did not find in the 2012 platform, which was in every platform prior to 2012. 1 word was God. What was the second word? Jerusalem. Those 2 words were omitted from the platform for some reason. They took any reference to God, any word God was pushed delete. It's like you go on your computer, you do search, you put in the word, and you delete all. The second word was Jerusalem. Mention of Jerusalem as the eternal capital of the Jewish people was in every single Democratic platform since Israel was refounded in 1948. It was taken out in 2012. This reporter leaks this, that, hey, the Democratic Party have taken out the word God in Jerusalem. It went viral. That's the only thing that night, Monday night, that every newscast was opening up with. God in Jerusalem, God in Jerusalem. Now, many Democratic senators are very pro-Israel. Many Democratic senators are believers in God. And they were fuming because who gave anyone the right to remove God and Jerusalem from our platform? So within the Democratic Party at that time, there was this whole revolt of who wrote this platform and why did you remove it? And that's all that was being spoken about. God, Jerusalem, God, Jerusalem, God, Jerusalem. If you don't know the rest of the story, they put it back in. And God was in there and Jerusalem was in there. But for 2 days, all this country was focusing on were 2 words. God and Jerusalem. I found it so refreshing. It was really great conversations that every newscast was having. How important is God in our lives and how important is Jerusalem? And there were great conversations to be had. And great speeches being made by the convention pro-God, pro-Jerusalem. So that's why I said this is not a political speech about one side or the other. It was historic as to what was taking place here at this particular convention. What comes to mind? So I want to take you to the scene in whatever synagogue you belong to, and someone goes up to open the ark, right? What happens when they open the ark? We stand and what do we sing? Vayehi ben Soharon, Vayomer Moshe, right? And then there's this line, Ki mitzion teitzei Torah, Ki mitzion teitzei Torah, Udevar Mirushalayim, God and Jerusalem. In our prayers, we put these 2 always together, God and Jerusalem, God and Jerusalem. What does that verse that we just sang mean? It means from Zion shall come forth Torah and the word of God from Jerusalem. God and Jerusalem. Where does that line come from? I know we sing it in the synagogues, but where did they take it from? The sages took it from the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah is talking about the Messianic era that Jack spoke about before. And he says that when you're getting to a Messianic era, he says, V'holchu amim rabim v'amru. Many nations will go and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. The nations of the world will come to the Jewish people, and they will say, teach us the way to God. And then he concludes, Isaiah, for from Zion shall come forth Torah, and the word of God will come from Jerusalem. When the world is doing well, when the world is going on its right path, it looks to Zion and Jerusalem and Yerushalayim for guidance and directions. You've heard that word Zion before, right? What is Zion? What is Yerushalayim? Zion in English is Zion. What does Zion mean? You hear it all the time, Zion, Zionists, right? Zionism. You're very familiar with the word, but what does it mean? What does Zion mean? But what does it mean, the word itself? Why not just call it Eretz Yisrael? So Zion is another name for Jerusalem. I get that. But there's a difference between the Hebrew word Yerushalayim, which is made up of Yira and Shalem. What does the actual word Zion mean? So Zion comes from the word, which means a marker, a sign, a banner. Zion. It's a symbol. It's an indicator. It's a flashpoint. It's something for all to see. Mitsuyanim are signposts, billboards.
And grades are tzionim.
Say again?
Grades in school are
Tzionim. That's also a sign. Another sign. So we're meant to serve, the Jewish people are meant to serve as living, breathing, walking, talking signposts. Not just a banner that you hang up on the freeway that maybe the driver looks or not, but we need to talk. And we need to be there. And we need to be right in front of people to show what goodness is about, what decency is about, what sanctity is about. And we need to serve as models, as banners for the nations of the world. Isaiah is telling us to be a chosen people, to act chosen, to actually contribute to the world. And you will know that you're close to this messianic time when the world comes to you and says, teach us. You're the chosen people. You're the people of the book. Tell us what we're supposed to do. We have to carry that message to the world. The message, Hashem Echad, that God is one. The message of universal ethics as outlined in the Torah, so that every human being aspires to the heights of compassion, of dignity, of decency, of divinity that he or she is capable of. How do we do this? We don't do it by proselytizing. We've never proselytized. We don't do it by preaching. We don't preach to the world. We're not looking to convert the world to Judaism. If you look closely at what Isaiah is saying, he's not saying make them Jewish. Teach them to be good. Teach them to be God-loving. Teach them to have fear of God. Teach them to live moral lives. We don't coerce. We don't showboat. We simply be who we're supposed to be. If a Jew lives the way the Jew is supposed to live, it rubs off on the world. When we live truthfully and we speak truthfully and we set forth that which the Torah tells us how to live our lives, then the world follows. The world learns from us. I have more to say and more than the time we have, so we're going to continue this, but I want to conclude this week's class with one story. I'll take your question in a minute. About 300 years ago, the chief rabbi of Prague was a man by the name of Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz. Legend has it that Rabbi Yonason was literally a genius as a child, born with a gifted mind. They say that when he was 5 years old, he was already considered one of the brightest around. He had that type of mind. And word spread throughout Poland that there's this kid genius in the Eibish's home. He was sharp, he was learned, he had personality already at that age. The talk about this child scholar spread throughout Poland that the king of Poland heard about it. And he wanted to see for himself, is there truth to this 5-year-old whiz kid? And so he gives an order to the parents. I've heard about your son. I'd like to meet him myself. I'm setting this date as an appointment for your 5-year-old to come see me in front of the royal court. However, you can't bring him. Nor will any carriage bring him. You are to tell your son that he has an appointment with the king on this day. You are to open the door of your house and tell him to go to the palace. If he is as brilliant as they say, he'll find his way here. If not, we'll know it's a fraud. The Eibishs get this note from the king. They don't want to do this. They don't care that their kid meets the king. Who needs this in their head? But he's the king of Poland, and they don't want a pogrom to happen by not listening. So they dress their little Yonason in his finest clothing. They put on his Shabbos clothes. They tell him that the king wants to see him, but that he has to find his way to the palace. So this little kid, this little Polish Jewish boy, dressed in his noble attire, heads out in the streets of Poland. He has to get to the palace. And sure enough, after hours and hours and hours of walking, he arrives at the gate of the palace. The palace guards are shocked. How did the kid find his way? This was before Waze, before there was a cell phone, before Google Maps. They let the king know the kid is here. Didn't come by carriage, no horse, no, he came. The king calls his court together, his advisors, everyone there, and has the king brought in. And he says, tell me, my boy, how did you find your way to the palace so quickly? How did you get here? Wanting to hear, maybe they cheated, the kid will tell us. His parents took him halfway, isn't it? How'd you do it? How did you not know, which was, maybe you were taking the wrong turn, maybe you're going the right way, the wrong way. How did you do it? So little Yonason knew a little bit about royalty. He bows his head. He says, Your Majesty, there were in fact many a times that I did not know which way to go. At first, I asked people, what direction is the palace? And they went like that. So I started going in that direction. But then you get to particular questions on corners, on forks in the road. Do I go to the right or do I go to the left? So I asked someone, do I go to the right or do I go to the left? The rules were not that I couldn't ask people on the way, so I asked. And they showed me the direction. So the king says, but what if you ask someone and the person didn't know? That's number one. Number two, how do you know they were telling you the truth? Number three, maybe they told you the way to go, but they were wrong. What did you do? He said there were times when I asked that I can tell the person wasn't so sure. So what I did was I asked the second person. Says the king. And what if the first person told you to go to the right and the second person told you to go to the left? What did you do then? So he said, I followed Talmudic logic. What's Talmudic logic? Talmudic logic is when one person says one way and the other person says another way, ask a third person. Once I asked the third person, I then again followed Talmudic logic. Talmudic logic is you go after the majority. So whichever direction two said to go in that way, that's the direction I went. And I made it here. So the king smiles. And the king says, okay, I hear what you're saying. In fact, I want you to listen to what you just said and follow it, be consistent. If your own Torah tells you that you need to follow the majority, and you see it worked, because it brought you here, then I need you today to announce that you are departing from Judaism, that you're no longer a Jew. King turned serious. Now he had an agenda. Why should I depart from being a Jew? Well, you just said that it goes by majority. The majority of the world are not Jewish. And therefore the majority wins. And you have to give up being a Jew because that's a minority. The king's court sees how brilliant the king was. He trapped him. Kid's stuck. What's he going to answer now? The kid clears his throat. He says, "Pardon me, Your Highness. I request Your Majesty's forgiveness for being a little bit unclear earlier. When I said that I would follow the majority, it was when I was outside the palace, trying to find my way into the palace because you asked me to be here. And so outside the palace, I went by majority rule. But now that I'm in the palace, now I'm right before the king. It doesn't matter to me what any of your court thinks, whether you are the king or not. I'm standing in front of the king. I don't listen to anyone but to the king. There's no more majority rule when you're facing the king. So if everyone tells me here, right, left, it doesn't matter. I'm here. In my life, I'm always before the King of all kings. I stand before God at all times. And when I stand before God, I don't care what the majority is, because I'm with God. It doesn't matter to me if the Jewish people make up 1% of the world, 0.5% of the world. It doesn't matter what kind of minority we are. We stand together with God. And when we stand with God, it doesn't matter to us how outnumbered we are. We do what we need to do. Hashem, the God of Israel, is everywhere. There is no place that he's not. And therefore, for me, I'm in the palace at all times. So even if the whole world disagrees with me, if it goes against what the king desires, I don't have to follow anyone. I know what my king desires. I follow my king. This 5-year-old child said it so simply, said it so profoundly. And this is why we say often on Rosh Hashanah, we say we should be a head and not a tail. Sheyiyel rosh v'lo l'zanav. Our job is to focus on what we have to be. The world follows, that's great. If they don't follow, we don't give up what we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to be influenced by the culture and society of our time. We're supposed to influence the culture and society of our time. Tziyun. That's what Zionism really means. Tziyun means to stand up as a banner, to say, this is who we are, this is why we are. And this goes back to what Abraham did. This is what everything about Abraham's life was about being a Tzion, being the signpost for everyone to follow. At first, how many followed Abraham? None. Then 1. Then 10, then 100, then 1,000, go on generations. So the fact that at first everyone's opposed doesn't intimidate us. Tzion, because we're that signpost. We'll continue next week on the same subject, God and Jerusalem, and continue along studying about Jerusalem, the holiness of Jerusalem, the physical Jerusalem, and the Jerusalem within us. Yeah. I'll take some questions now, but you can take us off the Zoom world. Yeah.
On the Temple Mount, there is a golden dome. Underneath the golden dome, there's a rock.
Yep.
Is that the rock of